Good morning. If you open your Bibles to Mark chapter 9, as we talk about the greatest help to our unbelief. Mark 8 and 9 is sort of the middle point of Mark's gospel, and it's really sort of a crescendo because Mark's whole point in this book is to argue that Jesus is the Son of God. He is the Messiah, and he spends the first 8 chapters giving all of these proofs and evidences that that is the case. And then the book sort of crescendos right in the middle in chapter 8 with a grand confession by Peter that Jesus, you are indeed the Messiah. And for the first time in Mark's book, that part of that turning point is that Jesus now for the first time starts to explain what that means, that he's the Messiah. Up to this point, it might seem like the Messiah, being the Messiah is all these cool miracles, because that's what he's doing for the first 8 chapters. But then right in the heart of the book, Jesus tells him actually what it means to be the Messiah is that I'm going to die and I'm going to rise again. And anybody who wants to follow me to glory, you've got to be willing to die and take up your cross and follow me. This would have been so confusing because no one thought that the Messiah was going to be killed. How in the world is dying a path to glory and a path to victory? So in Mark 9, Jesus takes Peter and James and John up on a mountain, and this is what happens. Look in Mark 9, verses 2 through 4. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and brought them up on a high mountain by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. And his garments became radiant and exceedingly white, as no launderer on earth can whiten them. Elijah appeared to them along with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. So here's Jesus, this lowly carpenter, doesn't look like a glorious ruler at all. Yet here on the mountain, he is radiating the glory of God. He is shining with the brightest white glow they have ever seen, just transformed before their eyes. Mark mentions the garments. Luke actually mentions Jesus' face was also glowing here. Now, we'll come back to this later, but let's fast forward now to what happens when they come back down the mountain. When Jesus is no longer radiating glory, Moses and Elijah are gone, and when he comes down the mountain, he has to go right back into dealing with this sin-cursed world. So, look at verse 14. When they came back to the disciples, they saw a large crowd around them and some scribes arguing with them. Can you imagine the contrast? I mean, Jesus was just up on the mountain in the presence of God, radiating light away from all of the bickering, away from all of the sin, away from all of the unbelief around him. Yet now he has to descend from the light back down into the darkness of everyday life. He comes down the mountain right into an argument. Even though it was just proven on the mountain that Jesus really is the Messiah, most likely they are arguing about whether or not Jesus really is the Messiah, because his disciples failed to cast out a demon. Notice verses 15 through 18. Immediately, when the entire crowd saw him, they were amazed and began running up to greet him. And he asked them, "What are you discussing with them?" And one of the crowd answered him, "Teacher, I brought you my son, possessed with a spirit which makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it slams him to the ground, and he foams at the mouth, and he grinds his teeth and stiffens out. And I told your disciples to cast it out, and they could not do it." It's not hard to guess, really, how this argument started. I mean, many of the scribes, you know about the scribes, right? They refused to believe that Jesus really was the Messiah. And so when they saw that Jesus' disciples failed here, that was a perfect opportunity to pounce and to say, see, he's a fraud, his disciples are a fraud, he's not really the Messiah. And some of the crowd probably agreed with the scribes and took their side. But of course, you got the disciples, they're defending Jesus, and maybe some of the crowd is defending Jesus, and they're sort of arguing back and forth about whether or not, Jesus really is who he says he is. Even after that climax in chapters 8 and 9, with Peter's confession and Jesus' transfiguration, people are still having a hard time believing. Unbelief is still alive and well. Not just among the crowds here and the scribes, but also in this father in the story, and also in Jesus' own disciples. Honestly, it's shocking that the disciples couldn't cast this demon out. Because just a few chapters earlier in Mark 6, when Jesus sent them out on the limited commission, he gave them authority over the unclean spirits. And it says specifically the disciples went out and they were casting out many demons. So why in the world couldn't they cast this one out? Well, let's cheat and look forward to verse 28 and 29. When he came into the house, his disciples began questioning him privately. Why could we not drive it out? And Jesus said to them, this kind cannot come out by anything but prayer. I think the implication here is the disciples were relying on their own power and not God's power. I mean, can you imagine trying to cast out a demon without praying to God about it? Without prayer? I wonder if, for the very first time, when they cast out a demon, that was probably pretty scary, probably pretty terrifying. They're relying on the Lord. They're probably in pretty serious prayer about that. And then maybe when they cast out the next demon, that's still kind of scary and they're still in prayer. But then, the next one and the next one after that, eventually you cast out so many demons, it just sort of becomes routine. And maybe you stop relying on prayer so much and on God's power so much. And you start to think, hey, we're pretty powerful. That's how it is sometimes for us as Jesus' disciples today. When we're first baptized, we are so aware of our dependence on God and we're praying to Him about everything. We're relying on His power and His strength. But as life as a Christian becomes part of the routine, we can stop depending on Him and praying to Him for help and for deliverance, and we start trusting in ourselves. And so Jesus says in verse 19, He answered them and said, O unbelieving generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring him to me. This rebuke may seem a little harsh, but I think it's a parallel with Moses' day. A lot of the statements that are made in Moses' day, because there's parallels with Moses in this passage. Moses, like Jesus, was up on a mountain experiencing the glory of God. And then when Moses comes down the mountain like Jesus, he's confronted with sin and unbelief because they all built a golden calf in Moses' day. And just as God was exasperated with Israel's lack of faith in Moses' day, so Jesus here is exasperated by the lack of faith all around him. So for instance, when Israel refused to enter Canaan because the giants were too scary, God asked Moses in Numbers 14:11, how long will this people reject me? And how long will they not believe in me despite all the signs which I have performed in their midst? And God makes other statements and questions to Moses, how long will I endure this perverse and crooked generation? So you see Jesus sort of pulling those themes together to say, look, the same unbelief that was going on all the way back in Moses' day, it's the same unbelief that resides. And this passage in Mark 9 helps us see that there are three different kinds of unbelief. Not all unbelief is the same. So, first of all, it shows us the unbelief that rejects God's power and goodness. This is the unbelief of the scribes, and maybe some of the crowd here. They completely rejected Jesus. They completely refused to believe that He had the power or the goodness of God at all. So that's the first kind, the unbelief that rejects God's power and goodness. The second kind is the unbelief that ignores God's power and goodness. This is the unbelief the disciples had. They didn't reject Jesus or God. They knew He had all the power and the goodness to cast out demons. They just ignored it and they started trusting in themselves. And then the third kind is unbelief that doubts God's power and goodness. This is the unbelief of the Father in this story. He didn't reject God's power or goodness. He didn't ignore God's power or goodness. He's just struggling to trust in God's ability and or God's willingness to heal His Son. So look with me in verses 20 to 24. They brought the boy to Him, and when He saw him, immediately the Spirit threw him into a convulsion. And falling to the ground, he began rolling around and foaming at the mouth. And he asked his father, how long has this been happening to him? And he said, from childhood. It has often thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us. And Jesus said to him, if you can, all things are possible to him who believes. And immediately the boy's father cried out and said, I do believe, help my unbelief. Put yourself in the father's shoes here. His son has been having these seizures, influenced by demonic possession since childhood. We don't know how old the boy is here, but because he says since from childhood, we can assume he's not a child anymore. So it's been years, maybe even decades. And how many times over those years or decades do you think this father prayed to God, please save my son, please help my son, to no avail? It may have been hundreds or even thousands of prayers, and yet still his son was not helped. And now this father, he gets a glimmer of hope because he hears that Jesus is the Messiah. Finally, now maybe my son can be healed, but he's put his heart on the line so many times before and been crushed. He's willing to risk it. I'm going to put my heart out there again. I'm going to dare to hope again. And I'm going to bring my son to Jesus and he can help. And so he brings him to the disciples, and the answer again is no, because the disciples can't do it. And his heart is crushed again. Is it any wonder then that he looks at Jesus and he says, look, if you can do anything, please help? Is it any wonder that he believes in God, but his belief is hanging on by a thread, and he is wrestling with doubts here? Now, gratefully, Jesus is patient with this man, and he assures him all things are possible to him who believes. And even though his belief was hanging on by a thread, Jesus didn't say, well, you don't have enough faith. Too bad, I'm not healing your son. He doesn't say that. Because remember, in another place, Jesus said, all you need really is faith the size of a mustard seed, and you can move mountains. So he took this man who's just on his last leg with his faith, and he says, I'll take just whatever little bit of faith you have left, and I will heal your son. And you see what he does is, he answers both of this man's prayers at the same time. He answers the prayer to heal his son, and he answers the prayer to help his unbelief. Think about how much it would have helped this man's unbelief by actually healing his son. Verses 25 to 27. When Jesus saw that a crowd was rapidly gathering, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, you deaf and mute spirit, I command you, come out of him and do not enter him again. And after crying out and throwing him into terrible convulsions, it came out. And the boy became so much like a corpse that most of them said he is dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and raised him, and he got up. There are a lot of ways that God can help our unbelief. He can answer our prayers like Jesus does here. He can put people of really strong faith in our life that sort of inspires us to be more faithful. That's what he does with Jesus here by putting Jesus into the life of the disciples. He gives us his word where we can read about amazing accounts in history where God delivers his people despite all odds, like David and Goliath and the walls of Jericho and the crossing of the Red Sea. And here in Mark 9, the healing of this man's son. He's blessed us with so much material on apologetics that we were able to teach a whole quarter on it. We can do research on all the evidence to build up our faith. And I believe even just praying to God, I believe, help my unbelief, is a great prayer that can strengthen our faith. Because even in that prayer, we are expressing our trust that God can help us. But I find it fascinating that this event happens right after the Transfiguration. And if you go back to verses 9 and 10, it says, as they were coming down, verse 9, from the mountain, he gave them orders not to relate to anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man rose from the dead. And they seized upon that statement, discussing with one another what rising from the dead even meant. See, the reason Jesus was transformed on the mountain was because it was a preview of the glory that he would shine with after his death and resurrection. In fact, Luke's account tells us that while Jesus was radiating glory and talking with Moses and Elijah, Luke says they were talking about Jesus' death. Because the point is, it's Jesus' death on the cross that was the true path to glory. And the ultimate proof that Peter's confession, Jesus is the Son of God, and the Messiah, was actually true. And if you think about it, Jesus' death and his glorification after his resurrection is God's greatest help to our unbelief, to all three kinds of unbelief. First of all, it helps our unbelief that rejects God's power and goodness. It keeps us from saying, I don't believe God really exists, or that he's good. Because in Jesus, God became flesh, so everyone saw him, and nobody could deny his existence. And he gave them 3 years worth of miracles, culminating in the resurrection, to prove and to build people's faith that he does exist. And then in his death on the cross for our sins, he made it impossible for anyone to deny his goodness or his love for us. Secondly, it helps our unbelief that ignores God's power and goodness and makes us think, maybe we don't really need God's power and goodness in our lives. The cross is a constant reminder that we cannot rely on our own power or our own moral goodness to save ourselves. We cannot rely on our own wisdom or strength to navigate life on our own. We're in desperate dependence on God. And the Lord's Supper is a wonderful reminder. It keeps us from forgetting. And it reminds us every week that Christ's sacrifice not only saves us, but it sustains us and cannot be ignored. It's why the Lord's Supper is a supper. It's food and drink, because it's meant to remind us, just like we cannot live without food and drink, we cannot live without Jesus' sacrifice, his goodness, or his power. And then finally, it helps our unbelief that doubts God's power and goodness. It's hard when, like this father in Mark 9, we don't get our prayers answered, maybe even for years. And we can start to doubt whether God can answer or even cares to answer. But as we learned in the daily Bible reading this week in Romans 8, if God did not spare his own Son, how will he not also with him freely give us all things? If I'm questioning God's ability or willingness to seek and to work all things for my good, the cross gives me a crystal clear answer that yes, God does care, and he is completely invested in what's best for me in love. If he had the power and goodness to rescue me from Satan with the blood of his Son, he has the power and goodness to answer my prayers in a time and in a way that is best for me. So as we partake of the Lord's Supper this morning, may the facts of the cross overcome the feelings of our hearts that may doubt God's love and power, and the failings of our heart that may ignore God's love and power. May the cross build belief in us that helps our unbelief.